Today's topic is, and it might be a situation where you can't hear me, but you'll be able to hopefully, where you can't see me, but you'll be able to hear me. All right? Hello?
Yes. That's the main thing, is to hear you.
So I'm going to try to do this while I'm, hold on 1 second. Just let me get out for a second. If you give me 1 second, I should be able to talk. Okay. I'm not sure how much I'll be able to read.
I'm concerned because Rabbi Roth was supposed to be here. He's not here.
Do you want me to wait?
Him. No, I don't want you to wait. Go ahead. I'll contact him.
Okay, great. Either way, you can hear it fine, correct? Okay, you're listening?
Yes, listening. I'm just texting Rabbi Roth.
So last week we discussed, the last time we met, which was before Pesach, we discussed the issue of Pidyon Shvuyim and its relationship to Mechiras Sefer Torah, as well. Oh, hold on 1 second. I just want to get smashed into here. As well as selling a Sefer Torah, and we tried to establish that when it comes to the hierarchy of mitzvos, that things are a little more complicated sometimes than they seem. So that, for example, what we discussed was that if a person raises money for tzedakah, it's, then another emergency takes place in the community, that, it is permissible in some cases, if he doesn't have a choice, to convert those funds, to Pidyon Shvuyim. Or if a person raises money for a Beis HaKnesses, and
but just to be clear, we said if the money, like I'm raising money now for construction, so I specifically pegged for the construction, I can't do that.
Right? Again?
That's only, meaning if the money was given specifically only for construction, you can't use. We said earlier you can only do that if it was just given to the shul randomly, but it was given for a specific cause.
If it was given for tzedakah, but it was not, but there was no specific stipulation that it can't be changed, so then that might be okay as well. As long as we're not violating something like Zela or something where you raise the money for one thing. But that's the general idea. Anyways, So in that context, the Gemara, continues. And if you do, does everybody have the Marmakomos that were sent out?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the same Gemara on Daf Ches Amud Beis, which talks about the importance of Pidyon Shvuyim, and we discussed how that is really a pivotal idea. So the same Gemara continues and discusses some of the details of general tzedakah. So the Gemara basically tells us that when you collect tzedakah money, I don't know if I'll be able to read so much because I'm actually involved here. Hold on 1 second. But the Gemara tells us that ein osin svaros al hatzibor pachos mishnayim. That when it comes to collecting money for tzedakah, that you need two people. The Gemara says this is on the Gemara on Daf Ches Amud Beis. This is the first entry that we have in the Marmakomos that I just gave out. The Gemara says that when it comes to collecting money for tzedakah, you need 2 individuals to collect, and you need 3 individuals to allocate to the different people, to make the decisions who to give the money to. Okay, that's what the Gemara tells us. So the question is why? Why do you need why these different configurations? The Gemara says because the reason for the 2 is Sroros Hudelo Avdi Hoimuni Mehemen, the Sayalel Rabbi Chanina, Dam Rabbi Chanina, Maisa, Mina Rabbi Shnei Achin ala Kupa. That you're allowed to appoint 2 brothers, is a very interesting halacha, to collect tzedakah, because the issue in requiring more than one person to collect is not that you don't believe what they spent it on. That's not the question. The problem is that it's an act of srara, meaning it's an exercise of authority. And as an exercise of authority, it requires 2 people. Why do you require 3 people to spend it? So the Gemara says that earlier the Gemara says that the three people to spend it is a result of being similar to a Maisa Bezdin. And as a Maisa Bezdin, you always need three. So it's very interesting that the models for collecting and distributing, tzedakah, establish that it's not just, like a technical function, or you get the most efficient or the most persuasive. Maybe the fundraiser is somebody who's the most persuasive, but the actual collectors have to have people who have a certain integrity. It's considered to be an action of authority, and as an act of authority, it requires that there be, two collectors and three people to distribute. Then the Gemara says, what is there about tzedakah that Maisrarusa? Says the Gemara, the Amar of Nachman, Amar Rabba, Baravua, Lefisha memashkinin ala tzedakah va'afilu be'erev Shabbos. The Gemara says that collecting tzedakah is an act of authority because you are allowed to coerce people, who have been evading their responsibility. Again, the president should listen carefully to this. You can coerce the people, in order to and enforce them, to give the amount that is appropriate that they're supposed to give. Says the Gemara, you can really force people to give tzedakah. Eini v'aksiv upakadati al kol lo chatzav. The Gemara says that if anybody pressures someone else, the Rabboni Shalom makes it his personal business to visit retribution upon them. In other words, you're not supposed to be pressuring people into doing things against their will. How does that relate to tzedakah? Clearly, if somebody's collecting tzedakah, that's not, it's not selfish. It's for the sake of the community. It's for the sake of the aniyim, right? Says the Gemara, Amar Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Bar Marta Mishmei Derav, Afilu al Gabai tzedakah. Even someone who's a tzedakah collector doesn't have the right to pressure other people to be lochates, to force them to give up tzedakah. So we have the stira. On the one hand, the Gemara says that you need two people to collect tzedakah because collecting tzedakah is an act of srara, right? And that's because you can you can coerce people to give tzedakah if that is, the amount that they're supposed to give. On the other hand, the Gemara says that upakadati al lo chatzav, that anybody who pressures people, improperly, that the Rabboni Shalom, takes retribution on them. So what's the answer to this apparent contradiction? Says the Gemara, ha da amid, ha da lo amid. Yehad Rava achbe Rav Nasan bar Ami b'shakal minei dalid mea zuzei letzedakah. So the Gemara says it depends. If we're talking about unfairly pressuring somebody who doesn't have the means to give tzedakah, so not only are you not allowed to do that, that is considered to be a violation, which the Rabboni Shalom himself, takes a personal interest in it. Upakadati al lo chatzav. That's a very serious matter. However, if it's a person in the community who's a man of means and he has the ability, and the obligation to contribute, so you're allowed to pressure him. You're allowed to go into his home if need be. Obviously, this is as a last resort. No one is suggesting that one should do this lechatchila, but afilu mimashkinin, afilu b'erev Shabbos. The word mimashkinin refers to the language of mashkon. A mashkon means you take a pledge. In other words, if he won't give you the funds that he's obligated to give to tzedakah, right, you are allowed to go into his home, and to take a pledge, that will, be a place saver, that will guarantee, that will secure, his fulfilling his pledge, his obligation, going forward. And then the Gemara tells a story of one Amora who enforced, the philanthropy of another to the tune of 400 zuz. Now, 400 zuz is a lot of money. exactly how
So,
much.
the answer to the question was the first person didn't have the means and you coerced them, and that's bad. And the other
Correct.
person has the means, it's okay. Just to be clear, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And obviously, this what is it? What is the significance of Erev Shabbos? So the Gemara explains that Erev Shabbos is a time when people are. Rashi explains is are Talmud, meaning they are preoccupied getting ready for Shabbos, and as such, right, we, can understand, that right now they don't have time to deal with these matters. But if we consider someone to be evading his responsibility, let's say he's hiding behind his, devotion, to Shabbos, in order to do so, meaning, it's not that this is the only time he has to get ready for Shabbos, but he's kind of putting you off. So even if it's Erev Shabbos and it's slow naive a little bit, it's guilty naive, to be pressuring him right now, even that is justified according to the Gemara. So what emerges from this Gemara is a discussion of when you can and cannot enforce the collection of tzedakah, and basically the Gemara has, contradictory.
So just to be clear, enforcing a collection means a pledge, right? It's collections. That's not getting a pledge.
It's not clear whether it's a pledge. Pledge is a neder. Here, the implication is that we're not dealing so much with a pledge as much as we are, let's say, dealing with the amount that the community deems appropriate, given its needs, the person's means, etc. The word pledge that I used before was mashko. I meant like a mashko, like a pawn pledge, that kind of a pledge. But I don't mean a pledge like you made a neder, like you made a commitment. We'll see that in a moment. That also is a factor, but that's not what we're talking about at the moment. Right now, we're talking about paying your proper share of the community obligation of tzedakah, which we'll get back to in a second. Okay, so this idea that there's kfiyah b'tzedakah under certain conditions came under fire by the Balei Tosas. Balei Tosas were troubled by the Gemara at the end of Masechet Chulin, which develops the following principle. Gemara says that kol mitzvahs hasei shematan skara b'tzeda, whenever the Torah itself defines skar ba'onesh, meaning the Torah tells you if you do this, you'll get blessing, you'll get a reward. If you don't do this, you'll get a punishment. It says that explicitly. So the rule is kol mitzvahs hasei shematan skara b'tzeda ein bezdin shalmata who's harin alav. The Bezdin here on earth, right? It's not its business to get involved. If the Rebbeinu Shalom himself tells you what's at stake, then compliance at that point is between man and his maker, and it's not the business, of the Bezdin. That is what the Gemara says in full. So Tosas here, if you see the third Bar Moko, Achvei Rav Nasan. Tomar on the parak kol abasar, the Gemara says in Chulin, kol mitzasei shamat niskara b'tzeda, ein bezin shamata muzorala, v'gabi tzedakah ksiv, pasach tiftach es yadcha lo. Tzedakah is a mitzvah hasei. That's the psukim that we read recently in Parshas Re'eh and the Parsha of Gimel Regalim that you usually read on the Moed. So we know that there's a mitzvah hasei to give tzedakah, but not only that, but the Torah also says in ksiv, Ki biglal hadavar hazeh yivarechecha Hashem Elokecha. So since the Torah says that if you give tzedakah, if you comply with this mitzvah, you will get a blessing. Yivarecha Hashem Elokecha. It sounds like it qualifies as a mitzvah hasei shematan skar b'tzeda. And if that's the case, there should be no coercion, because if the Rebbeinu Shalom himself defines, the stakes of this particular mitzvah, that should be good enough for man. Bezin should stay out of it. Man should stay out of this enforcement. Everybody with me? That is Tosas's question. Not only Tosas, but following Tosas, the Chachmei Sfarad asked this question. It's a very, very popular question. Okay. Of course, this question is based on certain assumptions. Number one, it assumes that when the Gemara says that, we're talking about enforcement, that we're talking about coercion or enforced payment. We're not just talking about verbal pressure. That's number one. It also assumes that we're talking about the mitzvah saseh of giving tzedakah and not a pledge, like you said before, promise, or a separate tzedakah tax that is levied on the community, because that doesn't come under the rubric of mitzvah saseh Shabbat and tzchar b'tzeda. That's not the parsha of the Torah. That's just an individual commitment that individuals make, right? So
it's like an assessment. What is that? Like an assessment? What is that?
Let's say the community all agreed, that every member, let's say you're building a new shul, and every one of the members, took it upon himself as a separate hiskayvus, as a separate obligation to contribute X amount. Now, that is protected under the laws of Mishpat of commitment and hiskayvus, right? It doesn't require, collection on the basis of the mitzvah saseh, in Parshas Re'eh. So the assumption is that we're dealing with something regular. We're also assuming that this is a typical mitzvah saseh shamat and tzchor b'tzeda. That's what Tosas quoted, L'man yivarecha Hashem v'lokecha, etc. Okay, so what we're going to see is that if you look at Tosas gives 4 answers to this question. Each one of these answers, well, let's say it this way. 3 of the answers question the assumptions upon which the question rests. Okay? The first answer of Tosas is that of Rabbeinu Tam. The Amar Rabbeinu Tam, the high kfiyah b'dvarim, kemo kfiyah, the parak nourishes pat. That's a little bit of a girsa problem here. So basically, the Gemara in Masechet Ksubos uses the expression kfiyah, which means coercion or enforcement. But there, it's clear that it meant verbal pressure, meaning I'm constantly, pushing you. When the Gemara says that mitzvah shamatim tzkar b'tzeda ain bezin shamatim muzarin aleh, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't pressure him. It just means you can't punish him, and maybe you can't coerce him. But to verbally persuade him, right, or to harass him a little bit, that might be perfectly acceptable. So the first answer of Tosas is that what looks in our Gemara like coercion and enforcement is really just verbal suasion. And therefore, it's not a problem. But in Achanami, when it comes to regular tzedakah, there is no actual enforcement coercion because it comes under the principle that is articulated in the Gemara. Okay. The second answer of Tosas is va'od tirates, the hocha kiblu aleim sheyachufu osan hagaba. That's the second point that we made. We're dealing with a situation where this tzedakah that we're talking about in the Gemara is not the tzedakah, that is based on, the general obligation to give in Parshas Re'eh, but rather this is a special allocation, that is a result of the needs of the community at a particular time, where there was like a tax or a membership fee, that was levied upon or agreed to, or both, by the members of the community, and as such, it's subject to Geviyah, not on the basis of mitzvah say, but on the basis of Choshen Mishpat and the laws that govern any situation where there's this chayvus, where you accept upon yourself an obligation. The third answer of Tosas, so again, the first 2 answers of Tosas, to make it clear, are basically rereading what the Gemara itself seems to have said. We thought the Gemara said that you can coerce when it comes to tzedakah, and it turns out that that's not what the Gemara really meant. Either the Gemara meant you can verbally pressure, even though you can't coerce, or we're talking about a situation, right, which basically, what we're talking about is an allegation.
What's the difference between verbally, and coerce? Don't you verbally? Coerce means physical, or it means verbal?
No, I mean verbally, pressure somebody means you call them up. You say, you really should pay.
Right.
That's not the same as. Is that the same as confiscating his?
No. Okay, I misunderstood you. So coerce is verbal. I don't understand. You can't. You can confiscate before they pledge, or we're talking about once you pledge.
No. The Gemara originally seemed to be saying, and the example was, Afilu be'erev Shabbos, memashkenin. The Gemara seemed to be saying earlier that you can really not only pressure somebody to pay his fair amount, but that you can actually grab an object of his, that you can confiscate his property in lieu of that collection. Closest is saying it sounds that way, but according to the first shot, that's not what it really means. It means that you can bother him, you can keep after him, you can call him a million times, and try to pressure him. That's the first answer of Tosas. The second answer of Tosas is we're not talking about tzedakah. We're talking about a separate commitment that is made, by an individual or by a community, and as such, that commitment stands in its own right. Okay. The third answer of Tosas is maybe the most intriguing. Tosas says, "Ulari nira." It seems to the read the betzdaka kofin mishum deisbe lav lo ta'ametz es levavcha. Tosas says, if there were only the mitzvah saseh of pasoach tiftach es yadcha, then the rule in the Gemara in Chulin would be normative, and we would not be able to coerce tzedakah because it's matan star b'tzeidah. However, since when it comes to tzedakah, there, in addition to mitzvah saseh, is also a lav, lo ta'ametz es levavcha, or there's another lav actually, lo tikbots es yadcha. Don't harden your heart, don't withdraw your hand. So since there's a lav in addition to an aseh, this rule that you can't coerce doesn't apply. That's what Tosas says. The problem with it is twofold. Number one, logically there's a problem. What do we mean? Why does it make a difference if there's a lav in addition to the aseh? The logic behind the principle of mitzvah aseh shamatan skar b'tzeidah ein bezin musar and aleha, the logic behind it is that the Rebbeinu Shalom himself has basically, revealed what the stakes are about listening to this particular obligation, right? L'man yivarecha Hashem elokecha. And since that's the case, it's not Bezdin Shalmata's duty anymore, right, to get involved with that. But if that's true, why does it matter whether there's only an aseh or an aseh and a lav? The same logic applies whether it's an aseh or an aseh and a lav. That's question number one. Question number two is, there are other dinim in the Torah which have an aseh and a lav, and in which the Torah spells out what the schar or onesh is going to be. And we know that they are treated like mitzvah aseh shematat schara b'tzeidah. For example, the Torah says that if you own an eved, and when you free him, hanek tanik lo, you're obligated to give him gifts when, as a parting, part of the freedom process is that you give him gifts so he can, stand on his own 2 feet. Hanek tanik lo, lo yishalchenu Chavshi. You shouldn't just let him go empty-handed. So there's an asay, hanik tanik. There's a lav, lo yishalchenu, chavshi. And nonetheless, the Gemara seems to say that is an example of mitzvah asay shamatan skaron b'tzeda, and ein bezet shamatan muzarin allowed. How does that fit with the Re's idea that since tzedakah, in addition to an asay, also has a lav, this principle doesn't apply? Number one, we couldn't figure out the logic of it. And number two, it's just not factually correct because we have examples of mitzvos that have an asay and a lav component, and they are treated as matan skar b'tzeda. Okay, so I'm going to table this question of the Re for just a couple of minutes. Everybody understand the question? Everybody hearing?
Can you say it one more time? I'm sorry, I missed it. One more time, please.
Okay. The Balei Tosas' third answer to the question is that whenever there's a lav in conjunction with the asay, then the principle of matan skar b'tzeda doesn't apply. The problem with that is, number one, logical, meaning if the reason behind the lack of involvement of Bezin Shalmata is the fact that the Torah itself, has weighed in, and told us what's at stake, who cares whether this is only an asay or an asay and a lav? That's the logical question. The factual.
What is the lav here?
The lav here,
yeah,
is, as Tosas himself says, which we read before, the lav is lo ta'ametz livavcha. You should not harden your heart. When you don't give tzedakah, you violate an asay. Pasok tiftach, open your hand. Pasok tiftach es yadcha. And you also violate a lav, the lav of lo ta'ametz es livavcha. Don't harden your heart.
So why do we have here? Why do we have on the mitzvahs aseh? We
Right.
have two words which one strengthens the other. Hanek, ta'anik. Isn't that enough? Wouldn't it be enough? Either ta'anik or hanek to the.
Are you talking about the hanok of the Eved?
We have the two words of the same thing. Surely there must be something stronger here.
Right, but it's interesting to note that the same is true in tzedakah. Pasoach tiftach.
Okay.
Two mitzvahs aseh in tzedakah. One is pasoach tiftach. The other one is nason titein.
Okay, another one. Sure.
Exactly. So I'm going to tell you my theory in the end. If not today, then when we finish this next week. But I'll tell you now. I think that the Torah uses double language because these are, the themes that are, embedded in these mitzvos are double themes. In the case of tzedakah, I'll explain this later on more, but I think that tzedakah is a double themed mitzvah. There's one aspect that has to do with the donor giving, and in that sense, it's almost like a mitzvah bein adam lechavero. I'm sorry, bein adam lamakom. And there's another aspect, and that is, the help that you're, obviously extending to your fellow, Jew. So I think it's always pasoach tiftach, and it's always nason. This is my personal theory. Nason tite. And I think that's true about Hanakas Eved too. There are two aspects to it. There's your personal obligation, what you are supposed to do, and then there is the benefit accrued by the recipient, by the object of your philanthropy or largesse. And therefore, I think in addition to being a point of emphasis, which it certainly also is, it's just a way of the Torah to kind of hint that there are two themes, two aspects to these mitzvot. And I do believe that is very important for the issue that we're discussing, which is the question of coercion, and we'll get back to that. So that's a very good question. But it's not just about hanik tanik, as I say, it's about pasoach tiftach, and it's about nason titein as well. All right, everybody with me so far?
Thank you.
Yes,
Okay, great.
yes, yeah. But I didn't know this. But so if someone holds back money, they're over a lob also. So you're helping them not create a lob. Is that right? As you were saying before,
So
they can't do
tzedakah
this.
has an assay and a lot. The Rambam, for example, counts, both an assay, and a lav when it comes to tzedakah. That's absolutely correct. Correct.
Interesting.
Hear me, by the way? Hello?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, we're here, Rabbi.
Yes.
Yes.
Are you switching places? I think he's switching out of.
Hello?
Yeah, we're here, Rabbi.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Is everybody here or not?
Oh,
Yes,
now,
we're all here.
now I can see you, Rabbi.
Yeah, we can see you,
One
Rabbi.
second.
You going into your office?
Just bear with me for 1 minute and I will
Sure,
be
take-
with you. 1 second.
Take your time.
Is everybody here now or not?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Yeah, 1 second. I'm just in the middle of shear. Hello?
Yeah, we're here. We can
Yes.
hear you, Rabbi.
Is everybody hearing or not?
Yes,
Yeah.
we're hearing you loud and clear.
Okay, now I can switch back to Zoom now because I just got back. So just give me 1 second and I'll continue talking and I'll try to get on Zoom as well.
You are.
Okay, so the
He's trying to get his computer Zoom, cancer. He's on a phone Zoom.
here. Okay, so so everybody has so basically we have again this Gemara. Everybody can hear now.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Again, in 1 minute I'll be hopefully on the computer, so that should be easier for everyone. Just give me 1 second. It'll just go faster this way. Hold on 1 second, and then I can.
I would only note that only a school president would come up with that last question.
Which question?
The one about convincing people to give tzedakah.
Okay. Rabbi Roth, your connection's okay? Rabbi?
Okay, just 1 second. Okay. Okay. Is this better?
It was good the whole time, but if you think it's better, it's good. It was good. If you think it's better, it's better.
Hold on 1 second. Okay.
Oh,
Everybody
yeah.
can see and
Now
hear now? Better?
It's good, yeah.
Hold on 1 second. Okay. So so we're in the middle of this Tosfos. Okay. That's it's not necessarily recommended to do what I just did, but I'm glad everybody was able to.
Rabbi, there's a little echo. I don't know. There's an echo now.
Too late. I came in a little late. Can you please tell me which daf it is?
We're on Daf Chesamid base.
Okay, thank you.
And give me 1 more second. I'm just you still hear an echo?
It's like a microphone. It's like you're talking to a microphone. Is there a microphone up or something?
No, there's not. There should be no microphone.
Okay. Maybe it's just louder. It's okay.
It's
Okay. So so again, one more time. So we are the Gemara here in Daf Chesamid base discusses whether there's kfiyah in tzedakah. Kfiyah means coercion or enforcement. The Gemara, hey, I see Dovi's here. Good to see you. The Gemara seems to say that it's a very interesting phenomenon. You have to be careful not to pressure people that you shouldn't. That's the principle of pakadati al lochatzav. But if somebody is amid, somebody has means, then it is appropriate to pressure him. Then Tosfos wanted to know how can there be any kind of pressure when it comes to tzedakah? After all, it's a mitzvah say shamat and schar b'tzeidah. And typically that means ein bezin shamata muzharin aleha. And we've seen so far 3 answers in Tosas, right? One answer is that we're not talking about actual coercion, we're talking about verbal pressure. The second answer is we're not talking about actual tzedakah, we're talking about a monetary commitment that was made by separate from the normal mitzvah of tzedakah. The third answer is the more intriguing one, which we haven't figured out yet, and that's the view of the Ri, who says that whenever there's a mitzvah say and a lav together, this rule of mitzvah say shein matan schar b'tzeda ein bezin muzhar and allowed doesn't apply. And we raise the question, why doesn't it apply? The logic still applies, and also the din of Hanakas Eved, this is the question of the Mishnah Lamelech. Hanakas Eved has an asay, Hanik Tanik Lo. It has a los asay, Lo Yishalchenu Rekam. And it is considered a mitzvah say Shematan Schar B'Tzeda. Okay. Then the Chazan asked a very good question, and that is about the double usage in Hanik Tanik, Nason Tit, I added Nason Titan, Pasoach Tiftach. And I was suggesting that in addition to emphasis, there may be like 2 themes or 2 motifs in these mitzvos, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Before we do, let's finish Tosas. There's another answer in Tosas. The rule that Bezdin will not interfere, when the Gemara says that the Bezin Shalmata will not interfere, Muzharin, they won't, involve themselves. What do they mean? So Tosas now is suggesting what that means is they won't implement punishment, but that doesn't mean that they won't confiscate or enforce, right? There could be 3 levels. One is, to warn, or to pressure. Let's call that one aspect. The second aspect is to coerce or to enforce compliance, let's say. And the third aspect is to punish, right? If you refuse to go along, to implement punishments. So now Torah says the din in Chulin is that Bezin Shomata will not punish you. But the fact that there is not only verbal pressure, but that there is also, the ability to confiscate, let's say, or to enforce, that is something that is true. For example, mokir avua, a person was not respecting his father. Kibbut aveim is a mitzvah saseh shematan schar b'tzeda, because the Torah also says there, l'man yarichun, yamecha, just like here it says l'man yivarechacha Hashem elokecha. The kaftuhu, right? So they were going to hit him. So they kind of, got him ready for Malchus, I guess. V'amar lahu, and then they said to him, shavkuhu, right? To leave him alone. Why? Because it's a mitzvah say shematan schar b'tzeda, and ein bezin shemata mutarim lahanish, to punish. But that doesn't mean that there's no enforcement. You can enforce, you just can't punish. Hachi prosha eincham muzarim lachricho ad sheyasek kashar mitzvah saseh. Where do we get the idea that there might be punishment for abstaining from doing like the mitzvah of tzedakah or the mitzvah of kibbut av? The answer is from a Gemara. The Gemara says in Ksubis and Daf Peches that if a person refuses to to sit in the sukkah, to take the daled minim, etc., then the kofino soad should take zinash. Now, obviously, we don't do this on a regular basis. That would be a little. There would be a lot of makas mardas going around, which there typically isn't. But obviously, the idea is what the Gemara is saying in Ksubis is that the bezin have the right to do this. Like if they feel the need, like let's say they find that somebody is not just abstaining from, but being disrespectful, by virtue of their abstaining, they have the right. Kofino soad shatetze nafsho. So what Tosas is saying is that's true in a typical mitzvah, but it's not true when the Ribono Shel Olam himself tells you what's at stake. When he says L'man yarichun yamecha, like in Kibbut Aveim, or when he says L'man yivarecha Hashem elokecha in tzedakah, so the ability to mete out an onesh a punishment, a corporal punishment for refusing to to discharge your mitzvah duties, that is no longer an option. But short of that, for example, confiscating, his funds, going into his house Erev Shabbos and taking a pledge, to make sure that he complies, and then he redeems it with the tzedakah money that he owes, that could be done. So that's the fourth answer in Tosfos. So while the first two answers basically reevaluate the Gemara, it looks like our Gemara said there is kfiyah b'tzedakah. Answer number one says it's not real kfiyah. Answer number two says it's not real tzedakah. Answer number four in Tosfos says there is kfiyah b'tzedakah, because even though it's a mitzvah say shemat and schar b'tzeda, the only thing you're not allowed to do is onshim, but you're allowed to do enforcement. And then the third answer, which we're still find enigmatic, is that somehow if there's a lab in the picture alongside an assay, that changes the equation. So let me mention three other answers quickly, and then maybe we'll adjourn for today and we'll pick up with this next time. But since we started a little late. Okay, so a third answer is something I once heard the Rav suggest. He suggested that there are, several parshios in the Torah for tzedakah. And that while the Parsha in Re'es seems to speak about individual obligation, nason titein pasoach tiftach, lo ta'ametz, lo tikpots, these are all addressed, on an individual plane. The other Parshios seem to talk about tzedakah as like, kimata achicha ha'evyon, on a communal level. So the Rav thought that maybe if tzedakah has a communal component, maybe that exempts it from this rule of mitzvah saseh. I'm sorry, mitzvah shamat schar b'teda ein bezes shamata muzarin aleha, because maybe that rule applies to individual mitzvahs like kibbut av v'aim, like hanakas ebed, but where there's a communal component, maybe this principle doesn't apply. So that's very intriguing. The problem with it is that it's speculative, number one, meaning that should change the equation with regard to matan skar b'tzeda is speculative. But number two is that even if there is a communal component to tzedakah, does that mean that it's a fully integrated aspect and it defines the mitzvah of tzedakah generally, even when you're dealing with it on an individual level? That's more, I guess, questionable, unless you want to say that the kfiyah cases are all cases where we're talking about an obligation, that falls under the tzibur rubric. But anyways, it's something to think about, something to consider. There's another very, very interesting answer in the Achronim, which goes as follows. If we read Tosfos carefully, right, when Tosfos wanted to prove that tzedakah qualifies as a mitzvah say shematan schara b'tzeda, right, Tosfos said, after all, the Torah says, pasoaf tiftach es yadcha, that's a mitzvah say. And where is the matan schara b'tzeda? Ki yivarechacha, right? Hashem Elokecha. So this is something that Achronim say, including the Rashash, but not only the Rashash. Is the pasuk Ki yivarechacha Hashem Elokecha referring to nason titein or pasoach tiftach? Maybe it goes on something else. Maybe the matan schar b'tzeda isn't on the mitzvah saseh of tzedakah. But it's in the parsha of tzedakah, clearly. It relates to tzedakah. The answer is there's another pasuk. It's a wild card pasuk. And that is the pasuk says in Parshas Re'eh, Lo yera levavcha b'sitchalo. When you give tzedakah, right, Lo yera. Okay, why am I not translating it? So, because I want to pave the way for two interesting pshatim. There are two Rishonim who count Lo yera levavcha b'sitchalo independently in the minyan of Taryag. There are 613 commandments. One of those is certainly the mitzvah saseh to give tzedakah. According to the Rambam, there's a mitzvah saseh and there's a mitzvah lo saseh, just like the Ri and Balei Tosas. But according to the Smak, Sefer Mitzvahs Katan, one of the Baalei Tosas. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak of Corville. Corville is the place in France. And according to the Ramban, in his Hasagos, his critique of the Rambam Sefer Mitzvos, the Ramban says that the Rambam made a mistake. He omitted a mitzvah of tzedakah that he should have counted. In addition to the asay and the lav, he should have counted lo yera levavcha b'sitchala. So both the Smak and the Ramban count lo yera levavcha b'sitchala, which is very fascinating. Even if you don't count it, it's a pasuk and it means something. What does it mean? Right? It's easy to translate, but what is it significant? I mean, lo yera levavcha, your heart should not, look askance, look as treated as bad, besitchalo, when you give it to him. So there are two very interesting perushim offered. So the Smak says what it means is it refers to the way that you give tzedakah. And the Rambam doesn't count this as a separate commandment, but he does speak about this issue because it's rooted in Gemaras. The Rambam says the highest form of tzedakah giving, right? There are two types of lists in the Rambam. One is like it's better to give alone so that somebody doesn't fall beneath the poverty line than it is, to give a gift when he's already poor. Because obviously the greater impact is psychologically, financially, etc., is to catch somebody before they fall. So that's one point that the Rama makes. That's one hierarchy.
Someone a job is a high level, right?
Yeah, for sure. What do they say? Teach a man to fish, whatever it is. So giving somebody a job, as you say, or giving him a loan, which allows him, to keep his job or keep his business and not fall beneath the poverty line, is actually far. You might say, well, it's only a loan, or it's a job and he's getting value, in return, which is true. So what's better, to give away $10,000 and not get it back, or to give away $10,000 or $5,000 and to receive commensurate value? Right. So from one point of view, it looks more noble for sure, to be not to be reaping any kind of benefit from what you do, or even coming out equal. But that's not what tzedakah is really about. It's about the effect that you have on the individual, and of course the psychological aspect of it is a component as well. So that's one list of the Rambam. The other list that the Rambam has is like, if you're giving tzedakah to an ani, like how should you give it? Seiser, begalui. So one of the things, of course, that the Rambam said, we're all familiar with this phrase, is that you should give, besever panim yafos. When you give, instead of, begrudgingly, or grumpily, or reprimanding the ani, or making a face, you should do it in an empathetic, way, in a way that is kind, and that is encouraging, etc. So that's called sever panim yafos. The Smak, when he counts lo yera levavcha besitchalo as a separate mitzvah, says it refers to that. It refers to giving besever panim yafos. Now, of course, that in itself is a very fascinating. Again, that is true. That giving graciously and with empathy, rather than begrudgingly, and in a mean way.
But isn't every mitzvah like that? If you take out the garbage for your mom or your wife, saying, I thought any mitzvah, keep it off the aim. If you do something begrudgingly,
it's always good to do things, enthusiastically and with a proper and good attitude, for sure. But you understand that, when you are losing, $10,000, and it's a much more challenging, proposition than other things, and especially
it matters
since
how wealthy you are. So
the ani is a vulnerable, person who, by virtue of the fact that he, is forced to receive, rather than to give. So his psyche is particularly, fragile. And so, put it this way, when it comes to kibbud av v'em or other kindnesses, or v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you don't have a separate mitzvah, do it and also do it nicely. So if the smak is counting a separate mitzvah, it's because this is particularly sensitive and urgent. Anyway, that's so it's fascinating. It's one thing to say there is such a halacha, like you're saying, in general, or even if there's a very specific halacha in tzedakah. For it to count as a separate minyan in taryag is even more significant. And we're going to go one step beyond that in a minute as well. So we'll just hold off for a second. The Ramban doesn't say that, has a different pshat. For the Ramban, lo yero levavcha b'sitcha lo means when you give tzedakah, don't think that you are sacrificing. Think of it, as you're doing the right thing with your money. Don't look yourself in the mirror and think of yourself
it's all the
as
same. It's
what?
the same thing. It's really the same thing.
No.
Using a word, the Torah uses the word yira, yud reish aleph.
Right.
It could be a yira, it can be a pachad, it could be.
No, we're talking about an ayin.
Ayin.
Ayin. Lo
Avchem
yera levavcha reish ayin. Ra.
milshon ra.
Yeah. Meaning, so the smak says it means lo yera levavcha b'sitcha lo. Don't be a bad sport. Don't be begrudging. Don't have a bad attitude when you give tzedakah.
I understand.
Ramban says no. Ramban says lo yera levavcha. In your heart, don't think that you just did something that was self-destructive for your own financial future. Don't think of it as as a sacrifice or as a self-inflicted wound. Lo yera levavcha. Don't in your heart, don't think of this as being something bad. It's an opportunity. It's it's a good thing. It's a right thing to do. These are both attitudinal. One is attitudinal toward the recipient. That's the smaks. The other is your own self-image. When you look in the mirror after giving tzedakah, what should be your perspective? How should you be thinking about yourself? Should you be thinking of yourself as a great hero, who just sacrificed, his children's Yerusha? Or should you be thinking, this is part of my obligation? Kol Yisrael Arevim Zela Zeh.
Well, you have to give 10%. So how could you be thinking you sacrificed your future? Then that would be against the Torah.
Say that again?
You have to give 10%. So what does that mean? You're sacrificing.
Well, the 10%, whether it's deraisa or not deraisa, that's not for now. But at the end of the day, your point is either way. The question isn't really a good question because you might have to. Let's assume you do have to give X amount.
Yeah,
That doesn't mean. What does that have to do with what you think about it?
But Rabbi, doesn't all this have to do with sparing the recipient's feelings? No one.
No, I mean giving the seiser is if you give it to him, he doesn't know, or you don't know who he is, he doesn't know who you are. That's certainly sparing his feelings. If you give it to him not begrudgingly, that is definitely giving it to him, empathetically. What the Ramban says, which is that it's all about how you, look at this obligation from your own standpoint. That has nothing to do with the ani. Everybody agrees you have to be nice, to someone who's vulnerable, who you're assisting.
But Rabbi, feeling good about giving something will obviously manifest itself in a demeanor that
encourages the recipient,
as opposed to if.
Right, I think there's a connection
within your heart.
Right,
you're giving it begrudgingly, but you're trying to put on a face. I don't want to show that I'm not happy. At the end of the day, it's one of the same.
I totally agree with you that psychologically, these two things are connected, but they're just very different. I mean, one is outer directed, towards the recipient, and the other is, about, it's a matter, we'll call it of hashkafa, of, your halachic, philosophic
outlook towards life, in terms of what, seeing something as an opportunity, the way that you look at money, the way that you look at, your communal, obligation. It has to do with a lot of things. Now, what you're saying, I think, is insightful and true, and that is there's also, in the end of the day, an effect one upon the other, and if you are gracious, then you're also going to, come away, you'll have a good experience and you'll feel that this was something that was, uplifting for you. If you feel this is, fundamentally an opportunity and uplifting, you're most likely to be gracious. So I think in both directions there is a connection, but that doesn't mean that they aren't two different things, because they are. One is, more focused on how you give, and the other is more what your attitude is, about giving. But what's most fascinating, but also, anyways, according to the Ramban, it's just fascinating that there's a separate in Minyan Payag that has to do just abstractly about the way you think of yourself, in the mitzvah of tzedakah. But what's even more interesting for both the Smak and the Ramban is what I'm about to tell you, and that is the Rashash's answer of Tosas's question, which is as follows. The Rashash says, who says that Leman Yivarechacha Hashem Elokecha goes on Pasoach Tiftach Es Yadcha, meaning there's a mitzvah say to give tzedakah, and if you do, Leman Yivarecha Hashem Elokecha, and then Hashem will bless you. No, says the Rashash. The Leman Yivarecha Hashem Elokecha goes on Lo Yeira Levavcha B'Sitcha Lo. Meaning, according to the Smak, giving it to him graciously, if you do that, Leman Yivarecha Hashem Elokecha. Or according to the Ramban, Lo Yeira Levavcha B'Sitcha Lo, if you have a proper attitude, you've cultivated the right, perspective on what it means to give tzedakah. So that's Leman Yivarecha Hashem Elokecha. So technically what the Rashash is saying is, what was the question that Tosas was dealing with? How could the Gemara say that there's kfiyah b'tzedakah? There should be no kfiyah b'tzedakah, because it's a mitzvah say, shematan schara b'tzeda. Right? And ein bezin muzharin allow. It's not bezdin's, domain. This is the Rabbanu Shalom. Says the Rashash, that you asked the question because you assumed that Leman Yivarecha Hashem Elokecha, this extraordinary, rare statement in the Torah, where the Rabbanu Shalom himself endorses, schar. You have it in Kibbut Abbe'im, you have it in Anakas Eved, you have it here. You don't have it in so many other places. You thought that was about giving tzedakah, but it's not. It's about one detail, how you give tzedakah, according to Smak, or what your self-perception or self-image is in the context of giving tzedakah.
It's a good chap.
That's Leman Yivarecha. But isn't that remarkable that the rare Leman Yivarecha Hashem Elokecha goes on an attitudinal, motif within tzedakah and not on tzedakah itself? That's a very remarkable thing.
That's a matter of education, really. And
You mean to convey these things as a matter of education?
Give the tzedakah, to educate them, to give the tzedakah with the heart, with the feeling, and even wish the poor man well and whatever.
And not perceive yourself as a hero, but perceive yourself, as a responsible party, but who can, should, and and it's in a position to help, and that that's a positive thing.
But all these elements coalesce in and I want to go back to what I said earlier in my mind.
Yeah.
Why do we go to the trouble of kind of, in a way, dissecting, so to speak? I believe it's because it's not what you give, it's how you give. It's the same thing with speech. It's not what you say, of course it is, but more so, it's how you say it, and that makes a big difference because we are human beings. And at the end of the day, particularly when someone is a recipient, that one's got to be very, very careful in all walks of life to spare someone's feelings, and if someone is in a weakened position in the first place because that person has got to accept tzedakah because he or she fell on hard times,
right?
To me, all of this speaks to that particular aspect of sparing people, and you know, as even the Rambam says, you should always have a smiling face towards people in general.
I think what you're saying is true, but it doesn't preclude. You started off by saying you're not sure why we're dissecting it. I mean, we're dissecting it because these are all things that are connected, but they're also, discrete, components. And if you don't identify them discretely, you just have like an amorphous, you don't end up with any of it, frankly. So if you can, I think it's very remarkable that the Smat and Ramban, count, extra mitzvos, and we'll see it's more than that. It's, it's also the double language that we were talking about before, and the fact that there's an assay and a lab. The multiple mitzvos usually reflect multiple emphases, multiple themes. That doesn't mean that they're discrete themes. That doesn't mean that they're unrelated. It just means that each one deserves like its own emphasis. Its own emphasis in many cases, including this one, as mutually enhancing each other. But at the end of the day, for example, what you said, of course it matters how much you give, because the needs of the ani, he cares if he receives $1,000 or $1, but it certainly also matters how you give it. You can give $1,000, and it can be a bad experience for him. It can be humiliating. You can give him $1 and he can feel like a king. But is it better for him to feel like a king and get $1 or be able to pay his rent with $1,000 and feel, that's already a hard call. So the best thing is, that he should feel like he's receiving what he needs. That's also by one of the shir of tzedakah is what he needs. De maksoro asher yachsar lo. The Chazal say, you don't have to make a person wealthy in tzedakah. There's a lot of fraud. There always has been a lot of fraud in tzedakah. I mean, it lends itself to that. It's the human nature. They just now discovered now. I mean, we all predicted it that all this a lot of this stimulus money was basically taken by companies or people.
Well, we can argue that, but we can debate that if they were entitled to it. I wouldn't call that fraud. There were people that didn't.
I'm telling you what I read. Apparently, there was a tremendous amount. I'm not talking about specific companies or people, but there was a tremendous amount of fraud because whenever you're dealing with philanthropy, whether it's government philanthropy in many respects is the worst, and because
the
again,
government itself.
Say again.
I said the government itself is a problem, but that's separate.
Oh, yeah. I don't want to get into into the. I don't want to talk about little government or big government. We can do it another time. But what I'm saying is universal. It doesn't matter if you're a conservative or a progressive or a Republican or a Democrat. I think hakomodin that the fact is that when there are mass programs, then there's always a lot of waste and there's always a lot of fraud. And then the reason for that is it doesn't have to be cynical. But there are people who it's inefficiency, but it invites unscrupulous people who see an opportunity, and that's very sad. But that's always the case. It's been that way from the very beginning of time. Why is it that Chazal said that you need 2 people to collect, tzedakah and 3 people?
What do you mean? The Gemara says you shouldn't have pockets if you go into the Beis Hamikdash, right? You weren't allowed to have pockets. You could take money.
Right. The Yisim Nikiyim. And, Moshe Rabbeinu, nobody was more honest than Moshe Rabbeinu, but he wanted everybody, he was very transparent also. Transparent in financial matters of the tzibur. Again, words get hijacked to other meanings, but...
It all comes from, in my mind, the dematerialization of money. When we talk about the government, is that under this idea that it's no one's money because it's the government's money, and therefore it's okay to pilfer, is to me amazing that people could even think that. Because as a matter of fact, it's worse than stealing from an individual, because at least you know who you stole from. and if you want to ask for forgiveness, but
Right.
if you're taking it from the pushka, so to speak,
Right.
and-
No, it's true. I mean, what people don't stop and they don't draw the implications of what they're doing. But as you say, like taxation, all these things,
Yeah.
these are all
people think that the money doesn't belong to anyone,
Right.
but it does. It belongs
Right.
to all of us.
right, and then they raise more of it because they need to because of the because of the shortfalls. So it's all very. This has been true from the very beginning of when as long as man's been man and he has an inclination towards Hamas, Gezel. It doesn't mean he can't overcome it. That's the whole point. That's what Kedusha Sa'adam and Tselem Elokim, is all about. But to pretend that he doesn't have, that potential, pitfall is to deny, the very nature of humanity. And it's not a coincidence. So that's why the Chachamim were very, very, careful about these things. They tried to be very careful about these things. So
I like very much the Leman Yera Levavchem, that it is the mannerism of giving the tzedakah. This is a wonderful chap. It's because the people, the aniyim, sometimes already don't care. They just want the money. And then some of them don't say thank you, some of them do say thank you, whatever. I think that lo yira levavchem, that's the way you give it, that would change the attitude also of the aniyim.
Interesting. I agree. Anyways, so just to go back just for one more second, and then I guess we'll wrap up for the evening. I'll tell you what's to come. So the Rashash's answer to Tosas's question, which one more time was, the Gemara seems to say there's kfiyah and staka, there's enforcement or coercion. The rule in Masechet Chulin is that whenever you have a mitzvah saseh shamatan skara b'tzeda, whenever you have a positive commandment where the Torah itself tells you what's at stake, and it seems like this is an example of that because it is a mitzvah saseh, noson titain pasach tiftach. It does seem like it's matan schar b'tzeda, l'man yivarecha Hashem elokecha. So how could it be that here there is kfiyah? So we had 4 answers in Tosas, and I mentioned the Rav Zatzal had a 5th answer. Now we have a 6th answer, and that's the Rashash, who says that l'man yivarecha Hashem elokecha doesn't go on the mitzvah of tzedakah. It goes on the attitude you have in tzedakah. Of lo yera levavcha b'sitchalo, which may refer to how you give it, or may refer to how you perceive yourself, and your the impact of your giving, which I think is just a remarkable idea. Either way, if that isn't, if the mitzvah saseh of tzedakah is not subject to l'man yivarech Hashem elokecha, then there's kfiyah like any other mitzvah. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because it's a little late, but I'm glad we were able to get in the share. But I want to continue with this next week. I want to go back and discuss the one sheet of the Re that we didn't really explain yet. The Re says, well, if there's a lab in addition to an assay, that somehow this rule in Chulin doesn't apply. Why should that be true? Okay, I want to get back to that. And I want to do that by analyzing the issue that I mentioned in response to the Chazan's ha'ara about the double language. So, meaning, what I'd like to discuss is what the nature of the mitzvah of tzedakah is really all about. To what extent it is just like any other mitzvah, like you're supposed to pick up the daled minim on sukkahs and eat matzah on Chag HaMatzos and sit in the sukkah and blow shofar, and you're supposed to give tzedakah? Or is it maybe very different than that? Because tzedakah really is an economic mitzvah, and maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's like an economic obligation.
You sustain.
Maybe the oni has the right, to demand support in the community. We'll see next week that the Ritva on your sheets here, and the Radva is also on your sheets here. The Ritva in Rosh Hashanah, the Ritva in Bava Basra, the Radvas in Hilchos Matnas Aniyim, they use the expression when it comes to tzedakah, they compare it to a bal chov. Bal chov means a creditor. Now, that's a very remarkable thing, but I'll elaborate next week. What I mean is, if I borrow money from someone, he's my creditor, I'm the debtor, right? I have to pay him back because I borrowed money from him. I took his money. Of course, I have to pay it back to him. I owe him. Why do I owe him? Because quid pro quo, I received something from him that was his, and therefore I'm obligated to return to him. Correct? I owe money
Correct.
to the ani.
Well,
Look at the ani give me.
But you can give anywhere you want. You don't have to give to that ani. Even if you only give 10%.
Okay, that's a question, right? Okay, that's
you
a
can
further
give
question.
anywhere you want to give.
Right.
But
So what does it
also-
mean then? What does it mean when the Ritva says that you owe money to the ani?
But
Okay. Well, I guess if you understand community or family first, but I guess we'll talk about it next week. But so,
Correct.
Rabbi, just to be clear, next week is 7:30. So back
Yes.
to 7:30, so everyone knows the schedule.
Okay, so
Okay,
next week is 7:30, and
Thank you so much.
we'll be back on regular this kind of Zoom, hopefully.
but
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Okay,
Here,
have a good
Rabbi,
night, everybody.
if I may take half
Sure.
a second,
Sure.
Rabbi, if I may take the oni when he stretches his hand,
Yeah.
he's not asking for a loan. He's asking for a gift,
Correct.
and so it's different.
Typically, I mean, it depends what he's asking for, but often, yeah. I mean, he might be asking for a loan, but yeah. Typically, he's asking for a gift because that's what he needs. You're not obligated to give him a gift if you only need to give him a loan. I mean, if all he needs is a loan, you can give him a loan. If he needs a gift.
Completely different.
Yeah, we'll discuss it. But remember, when you give somebody a loan in halachic terms, that's also a gift because you're not allowed to charge interest. So
Yes.
you are forsaking the advantage of having cash on hand, namely, the assumption in commercial societies or capitalistic societies that access to money, is itself a value.
So
Which
does
is
that
true.
count as
Definitely true in our society, right?
so does that count as maser? The lack of gain, the lack of
No.
no?
No.
It's not the tithe. It doesn't qualify as a tithe because in fact
No.
you're losing money.
Maser ksafim is actually money that you give away. Yeah, but you can't calculate your lost interest. But remember, when you give a loan, but that's the point, that when you give an interest-free loan, it's called a loan, and it is a loan, but on a certain level, it is a gift.
Mhm.
Yeah, but it's a Gmilus Chesed, and the question is, what does Gmilus Chesed mean?
Well, all of this is Gmilus Chesed. Tzedakah is Gmilus Chasadim. I mean, it is.
Sure.
Well, we'll pursue this next week.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you
Thank
Have
very
a good
much.
week, everybody. Dovi, good to see you.
You too. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, I'm glad you're able to get on.
It was great. It was great. Yes,
Okay, everybody else have a good week too.
Likewise. Hi, Rabbi Roth.